This is ChangeMakers with Katie Gore, finding the right solutions for the affordable housing community.
Thanks for joining me for part 2 of my conversation with ChangeMaker Dr. Karen DuBois-Walton, the president of Elm Cities Communities and the Housing Authority of the City of New Haven. Karen, before we continue with our discussion about housing in your part of Connecticut, for people who are listening and aren't familiar with New Haven, where is it located and what is unique about it?
New Haven is this wonderful city of about 130,000 people in Connecticut. We are about midway between New York and Boston, home to Yale University, a real biotech center in the region. We have a long and wonderful history of immigrant migration here. Folks that came here to what was originally the land of the Quinnipiac and have come in successive waves and created community here, including to today where a number of our new immigrants are coming from Central America and Latin America. So we've got a pretty diverse mix. That's about a third folks of African American background, about a third folks who identify as Latino or Latina, and about a third who identify as white. We are in one of the richest states of the country, but we are a rather economically depressed community with a pretty significant gap between the median income of Connecticut, around $80,000, and New Haven's median income, which is more like $40,000. So we deal with issues of income disparity and racial and economic segregation here, some town-gown relations between the university and the community, but all from the spirit of a very progressive community that's seeking to figure out and solve problems together. Folks here would get on me if I didn't mention that we are home to some of the best pizza in the country.
Well, that's definitely unique. So I did not know that. That's a good fact to know. And you've also described really a cocktail here for affordability challenges. I'm sure that is facing New Haven, with high cost housing and limited availability. So where do you and your agency step in to affect that?
Yeah, about 34% of the housing stock in New Haven is subsidized housing, and yet we have still a continued and growing gap between what people can afford in terms of housing costs and what the income base in the community is. And we are simultaneously experiencing a period of great growth with a lot of new housing coming in downtown, and much of that being market rate housing that's not including affordable component. We've been doing in our portfolio is taking what had been the older public housing stock and transforming that into really wonderful new communities that are mixed income communities that are of the highest quality housing, communities of choice. And we're doing that with an eye toward trying to desegregate our communities by creating greater opportunity for all families to consider housing. So to have other developments come in that are continuing to segregate us by income is a challenge for us. So we've been pushing hard to create equitable housing policy within the city and within the region and our state, such that we can get affordable housing sited in a sort of broader number of communities, create a pathway for families into more and more communities, while simultaneously investing in the urban centers that for so long have been under-resourced. So that's our pretty big challenge that requires some local policy change and some state policy change at this point, as well as support at the federal level.
So along with those policy changes, I'm sure your development goals and your capital improvement plans have established kind of a path for you guys moving forward. I think I read that you guys have about a $70 million capital improvement plan. What's going to be happening over the next few years in regards to that?
Yes, we have been at redevelopment in a significant way since about the late 90s, looking at this housing stock that's been around since about the 40s and underinvested in for decades, and figuring out, how are we going to transform that into communities that really work for families. And so many of these have been tear down and complete redevelopments. And so we have a few more of those in the pipeline. And there were others where the bones of the building were good, but they needed a real significant overhaul. We're working through a number of tools, including HUD's mixed finance approach. We've used the rental assistance demonstration initiative and have a pretty significant portfolio award that's allowing us to move through our remaining portfolio. So in that, our families are having an opportunity to remain in something that is affordable, but much improved, much higher quality housing, improved systems that create more energy efficiency and then therefore more environmentally friendly properties, and aesthetically very pleasing. And that has also spurred additional investment in the community around us. So as we improve our things, our neighbors invest in their properties as well. So there is that spillover economic development that happens, which is good for our local communities and good for our local economy.
I'm sure the people who have been living around those communities, just have welcomed this type of investment. And like you said, then it has caught on and, become an overall movement. And, in speaking of some of those stigmas or community movement, you talked about how housing has always been portrayed as a segregation. But I know one of the things that you did was that you literally took down fences around some of the New Haven property, and that had long separated the public housing community from, its neighbors. That is a symbolic gesture of trying to be more, incorporated and inclusive and less segregated. But walk us through what led you to do that, and, what perception changes that, or even community imaging changes that happened when that decision was made?
Sure. One of the unfortunate aspects of housing policy history in this country has been how housing policy has been used in such discriminatory ways and has been used to limit opportunity for families, and has really played into the racist stereotypes that been since the founding of this country, so fundamental to our country. So we have an opportunity to take a look at the public housing portfolio that had developed over, the 1940s, and look at the challenges that the original design presented for us. And we had this community in the western part of our city that was immediately adjacent to our suburban town neighbors. And out of concern about affordable housing and who lived in it, the town and city many years ago had decided to erect a fence between the two communities. The neighbors felt very strongly about that fence remaining in place because of all of what happened in public housing over the years of disinvestment and segregation by income and by race. And as we ended up with a community there that had been underinvested in for years, we had all of the problems that came along with concentrated poverty. And the community next door was fearful of that. And so when we emptied it out and started redeveloping, and then began talking about tearing down this fence and creating a new connection between the communities, we needed to think about taking this fence down. And that made our neighbors very nervous. We held a number of community meetings that were widely attended, where people expressed all of the hateful things that you think one might hold about classist and racist kinds of beliefs, but I didn't expect would be said. All of those things were actually voiced during the meetings. And yet we persevered because we knew what was possible when we create real housing opportunities for families, when we create these new communities, when we create mixed income communities with the resources that families need to be successful. We knew that we would create that in this area as well, and that part of that redevelopment required us to take the fence down. So after quite a battle, we were able to actually remove the fence, create the road connections between the two towns, and all of the fears of traffic and crime and nuisance behavior that was feared never came to pass. Just as we thought, we have two very peaceful communities living side by side with no significant issues arising between neighbors on the the suburban side or the city side. And we, in fact, now have a beautiful new affordable housing community that has been connected back to its neighbors next door, and the opportunity that comes from being able to drive a much shorter route to shopping and to job opportunities, and creating a sense of an inclusive community and not something that was a walled off community.
There's been a lot of research and, academic publications that actually go back and look at that 1940s design. And that combination of that with the underfunding created such a concentration of poverty. These things, though, now as we are redeveloping and building new properties, we've all learned. And, looking back on the past, and we're looking forward to the future, so were there specific things that when you redeveloped these communities that you guys incorporated in the design to really set them up for success?
Absolutely. There is a lot of research into how you create spaces that people feel some sense of ownership over. And we incorporate that into the best models of urban affordable housing design. So we no longer build the sort of barrack-style developments with all shared space, and instead create things where people have a sense of their own front door. They have their own front door and back door with their own yards and places that they feel. I think the term is defensible space. It's spaces that people feel like they have some ownership over, and that creates a very different sort of behavior in terms of your desire to want to pick up a piece of litter off that property is different when you feel like it's your property versus it's just some other common space that someone else is responsible for. Your desire to manage what happens on your property is different when you feel like it's your property. So that's been huge in terms of a design change. We create places that have a more traditional street grid as opposed to a lot of cul-de-sacs and things that feel isolated and cut off. So it really feels like it's a part of the community because it is a part of the community. So a design that looks different in that way. Certainly lots of upgrades, right, in terms of energy efficiency and things that are different in the development design now. And importantly, the families that are living there are now a mix of families who we have home ownership units that are market rate home ownership side by side with a unit that might be an affordable home ownership unit. We have rental units that rent at the market rate side by side with the units that rent at a subsidized rate. And that ability to build communities where people of all income levels find home, create home, is a very different model than what we saw failed when we ended up really warehousing all of the lowest income families together in one community with very few services or supports. So we end up with vibrant communities where we've got families raising children, we've got our elderly at the later stages in life. We have families who are in the workforce. We have families who might be living with a disability, all living in one community. And it creates a vibrancy and an energy and an ability to support each other that just had fallen apart as our older communities had deteriorated. So it's exciting new models that work much better for communities.
If there were one or two things that would help you radically change affordable housing for your community, what would you say those would be?
I think that affordable housing could change significantly in New Haven if we looked at our communities in that same way that I just described as wanting to be places where people of all backgrounds can find home. And so we need to ensure that the policy that we have in place is not creating communities that are only for the wealthy and well-resourced and other communities that are only for our lower income residents. And that's work within our city, but it's also work with our suburban neighbors and statewide work that needs to happen around zoning reforms in this state. So that feels very important to me. Secondly, I think we would need better resource these programs. The federal government's own estimates say that only 1 in 4 income eligible families in this country actually receives the affordable housing supports that they should be entitled to. That's a policy decision that's been made in this country to allow families to remain in poverty and to remain unhoused. And I think we need to make some significant shifts around where we're putting our resources and deciding that it's more important that we ensure that everybody has a safe and decent home over the privileging of the wealthy, and deciding that we don't want to that we want to continue to subsidize home ownership for the wealthy, or knock tax at the higher income levels. I think we need to make some policy decisions that reflect a value that we believe that people are entitled to, a safe and decent place to live that they can afford. And I think that would be a pretty significant shift in federal policy and state and local policy. But it's one that would align our budget with a value that really values people.
Dr. Karen DuBois-Walton, I thank you so much. You are doing such an amazing effort within New Haven and the region to really remove barriers to fair housing and if I can be as bold to say, reverse housing segregation patterns, because of such all the nonprofits that you're involved in, and just really your passion. You're doing an amazing job in investing in under-resourced communities. Send your team a big thank you, because I know it takes so many of you to be able to move this forward. So I appreciate your time on the podcast here, and keep up the amazing work.
Thank you so much. I appreciate the opportunity to talk with you about the work the team is doing here.
Thanks for listening to Changemakers with Katie Gore. To find out more about Katie, go to quadel.com. That's QUADEL.com. This has been a production of Forbes Books Radio.